got an exclusive offer available to fans of Timeline. If you go to History Hit TV, you can either follow the information below this video or just Google History Hit TV and use the code TIMELINE. You get a special introductory offer. Go and check it out. In the meantime, enjoy this video.
April 1885, chaos reigns in the West. Once a mighty power, the Iron Confederacy face ruin and starvation as the prairies change around them. Renegade chiefs and warriors take up arms in a desperate last stand to save their people's future. Conquer, surrender, victory, defeat. These deadly battles shaped continents. These are nations at war. In the 1870s, the Canadian West is a land totally transformed. For generations, the buffalo had been at the center of life, feeding the First Nations and forming the bedrock of trade which would link them to the outside world. It had begun with the arrival of British ships in Hudson's Bay in the late 17th century. Over 1,000 kilometers wide, this inland sea drains into a system of rivers and lakes which reach 3 million square kilometers across the heart of Canada. The bay and its waterways were the gateway for Europeans into the vast territory which lay beyond.
Their first forays into the West was a product of their relationship with the First Nations.
Making contact with Indigenous peoples of the interior, coming to know the lay of the land through Indigenous guidance. They were opening the West to future colonization, in a sense, without knowing they were doing so.
And in the Neheyawak, the British found their perfect partner. Better known as the Cree. Their peoples claimed a land which reached from the Gulf of St. Lawrence to Alberta. The eastern and northern Cree adapted to the rugged wilderness of the Canadian Shield, while those in the west had been shaped by the grasslands they now called home.
The First Nations hunted the buffalo. They used them for food, clothing, shelter, weapons.
Their lives revolved around the buffalo arriving and leaving, and they followed in its wake. It was a fundamental staple, not just as food or a source of clothing, but it was a fundamental component of their cultural and social life.
Blessed by geography, the Cree became the ultimate middlemen for the Hudson's Bay Company beginning in 1670. From their headquarters at York Factory, the company relied on their Cree partners for almost 200 years to guide their trappers through the interior and fuel the insatiable demand for furs and bison meat. The Cree had become a key part of an increasingly global economy. With access to European manufacturing, horses, and guns, the Cree were wealthier and more influential than ever before. But success bred enemies. To the west, the nomadic Niitsitapi could be partners one day and rivals the next. Armed with guns and horses, the Blackfoot Confederacy could challenge for dominance of the western prairies and the vital buffalo herds which roamed them. But the Cree had their own allies. The Saulteaux, a plains-dwelling branch of the Anishinaabe. To the south, the Assiniboine and Stoney, two branches of the Nakota Sioux. Their forefathers defied the Seven Fires Council of the Great Sioux Nation, moving north to forge a new partnership, Neheyawak, the Iron Confederacy.
In terms of Western Canadian history, you could say that it was the Iron Confederacy and the Blackfoot Confederacy who really shaped the way that politics on the plains developed.
But all their power couldn't protect this alliance from its own success. The more the Cree traded, the further British influence spread, until they considered wherever the Hudson Bay drained part of their empire, Rupert's Land. The first European settlement was built in 1812. It would not be the last. The growing number of outsiders brought with them devastation. Foreign diseases ravaged Aboriginal communities, killing thousands. The chaos caused by these pandemics soon led to war, as powerful nations turned on weaker rivals. Hunted to near extinction by foreign, Métis, and First Nation hunters. The buffalo, the most important food source of the plains, disappeared from almost all its native range.
The collapse of the buffalo herds on the prairies was extremely devastating for the First Nations.
In the Iron Confederacy's hour of need, their old Hudson's Bay Company partners were of little help. By 1871, the company's stake in the West, along with British Columbia, had been absorbed into the Dominion of Canada. This young nation had big plans for its vast new territory, building an agricultural heartland through settlement and a railroad which would stretch from coast to coast. Standing in the way of Ottawa's grand ambitions were the First Nations.
They were in the way of Canadian progress, that they stood in the way of the ability for the Canadian government to open up the West to settlers, to people that were frankly white and preferably Anglo-Saxon.
Where the United States used their army to hammer First Nations into surrender, Canada used the numbered treaties and the Northwest Mounted Police. Hoping the promise of peace and food would lure the First Nations into accepting Canadian law, while Ottawa completed their monumental land grab.
Sir John A. Macdonald viewed the First Nations and Métis people as sort of wards of the state, especially the First Nations people. Macdonald viewed them in a very patronizing, patriarchal way, this idea that the state had a responsibility to care for their sort of barbarian children, their heathen children. As these were type of the words and descriptions used to describe First Nations during this period.
As word of the U.S. cavalry's assault on natives filtered north, many chiefs and councils agreed to sign.
They were put on for reserves and they were given treaties which indicated they were going to be fed, taken care of, their families looked after.
Cree chief Big Bear attempted to forge an alliance of prairie nations to negotiate better terms from the government. By 1882, the desperation of his people forced Big Bear's hand. He would sign Treaty 6. The veteran politician had his doubts that the Canadians would keep their promises. He was proven right within 3 years.
The Caucasian people were going to make them into farmers instead of gatherers and hunters.
Imagine living our lives around one species that comes and goes, and then 1 year it doesn't come anymore.
As conditions worsened for the Cree and Assiniboine, Ottawa largely ignored the humanitarian crisis, more concerned with the financial troubles caused by construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway.
Not only do they have to learn these European methods of existence, but then they get blocked out of it. And they get marginalized, and they're basically told, because of who you are, because of your race, because of your culture or your spirituality, you're not allowed into our system.
While influential leaders like Big Bear and Poundmaker tried to achieve results by peaceful protest, despair quickly turned to rage. With nowhere left to turn, Cree and Assiniboine would use violence to make Ottawa pay for their betrayal. Spring 1885. tensions on the prairies between First Nations and the Canadian government have reached their boiling point. On March 26th, a Métis attack on Duck Lake plunged the region into war. 2 days later, Chief Poundmaker besieged Fort Battleford with a band of Cree and Assiniboine warriors, looting and burning the town, while civilians and the Northwest Mounted Police huddled behind the fort's walls. Inspired and angry, Wandering Spirit, the war chief of Big Bear's band, led men against the town of Frog Lake, searching for food, horses, and guns. After seizing the town, Wandering Spirit's men captured the hated Indian agent Thomas Quinn, a bureaucrat who had shown little regard for First Nation suffering. With the town in his hands, Wandering Spirit ordered the captives to march back to their camp. When Quinn stubbornly refused, Wandering Spirit shot him in the head. In the chaos that followed, another 9 prisoners were killed, including Catholic priests. Wandering Spirit's attempt to equip an armed resistance backfired horribly. Big Bear had tried to keep his people out of the fighting. Now Wandering Spirit forced his hand. Already fighting Poundmaker and the Métis, the Canadian government would answer defiance with force. Before the uprisings of 1885, the main source of government authority in the prairies had been the Northwest Mounted Police, a paramilitary cavalry force created to keep out American whiskey traders and enforce treaties with the First Nations. This forerunner of the RCMP was Ottawa's eyes and ears in the region. But with only a few hundred in their ranks, these mounted police would have to rely on the support of hastily trained militia who had little experience in plains warfare.
A lot of the Canadian troops, they weren't from that area. They were from Ontario and Quebec. They had no local knowledge.
The Cree and Assiniboine had spent generations fighting for dominance against powerful rivals like the Blackfoot and Sioux. Armed with shotguns and rifles, the Iron Confederacy's warriors could deploy in fast-moving guerrilla bands or gather and attack en masse. While the resistance had local expertise, they lacked a steady supply of food and ammunition, something the newly built railway could provide government forces. To achieve anything from their rebellion, the Cree would have to move quickly before thousands of Canadian troops arrived from the east.
They had old weapons and they had even less ammunition than the Métis. And they were hoping the Métis could supply them with ammunition if and when they arrived.
Denying the government valuable strongholds would allow the resistance to negotiate from a position of power. The Cree were going on the offensive. April 13th, 1885. Francis Dickens awakes to a terrifying sight. The garrison of mounted police commanded by Dickens at Fort Pitt were totally isolated. Besieging his outpost from the high ground were over 200 Cree warriors. Their only means of summoning reinforcements was by dispatch rider to Fort Battleford. But every party sent out was either captured or cut down by Cree sharpshooters. With too few men to hold back the Cree, Dickens decided to surrender, hoping to prevent a massacre like Frog Lake. The policemen were allowed to withdraw, while Big Bear quickly declared the civilians his hostages. This was not a calculated political decision, but an act of mercy. Only Big Bear's prestige and political power would shield them from the rage of his band's more militant warriors. The fort itself was put to the torch. Big Bear had hoped to meet the Canadian government with a united front of Aboriginal nations, strong enough to peacefully force Canada to negotiate a better treaty. The destruction of Fort Pitt had left him only one option: to fight an enemy which outnumbered him 10-1. Spring 1885. The Northwest Mounted Police are on the run across Saskatchewan. By April 15th, the Cree were burning forts crucial to maintaining their foothold in the territory. To prevent other First Nations from joining the war, the Canadian government turned to an influential Aboriginal leader. Blackfoot Chief Crowfoot was a veteran warrior and a canny politician. Seeing the rebels' desperate position, he supported peace rather than join in the fighting and turn the guns of the Canadian Army against the Blackfoot. Crowfoot's prestige won out over more militant opinions. With their position in Alberta secured, the government forces could focus on isolating pockets of resistance and destroying them. The Iron Confederacy's warriors had defeated lightly armed mounted police. Now, they would face thousands of Canadian troops and artillery deployed from the east by the railroad. Meanwhile, militia under General Bland Strange disembarked from Calgary, moving north towards Big Bear's camp at Frenchman's Butte. The eastern contingent broke into two columns. The largest, under Major General Middleton, moved against the Métis capital of Batoche. The smaller, under Colonel William Otter, marched to reinforce Battleford.
The Canadians had cannon, and they had a Gatling gun, and they had a more modern rifle, which is more rapid fire.
Just across the river was a Cree Assiniboine camp at Cutknife, where Poundmaker's warriors laid in wait. On May 2nd, armed with a Gatling gun and two artillery pieces, Otter's column of over 300 men attacked Poundmaker's band after a grueling night march. Otter had hoped to launch a surprise attack. Poundmaker's warriors had easily spotted their advance. Despite the government's heavy firepower, the warriors used the rough terrain to their advantage, attacking in small groups from all sides. They made it impossible for the Canadians to direct a counterattack. Caught in the open, under withering fire and their artillery breaking down, Otter's attack descended into a chaotic retreat. Poundmaker restrained his warriors from destroying the fleeing government forces. This impressive victory would prove to be in vain. Within 10 days, the Métis at Batoche were battered into submission by the Canadian artillery.
Poundmaker encountered a supply train, and he took 22 prisoners, captured the supply train, and then they received word that Batoche was under siege. So they stopped to have a council to decide what action they would take when they arrived. And unfortunately, before the council was over, Batoche fell.
Facing a second government column with no allies or supplies, Poundmaker wisely decided to lay down arms rather than waste lives.
He tried to negotiate terms, but he was told that they didn't accept terms from the Métis and they wouldn't accept terms from him.
On May 26th, at Battleford, where his people had begun their fight, Poundmaker surrendered. With Poundmaker and the Métis defeated, only Big Bear's band remained in open defiance. On June 2nd, General Bland Strange began the attack against his fortified position atop Frenchman's Butte. The Cree warriors had fortified their position atop the hill, with rifle pits and trenches, making a direct assault nearly suicidal. Big Bear's warriors held off their enemy for hours until they were running low on ammunition, when he used a lull in the fighting to withdraw his men. After a final skirmish on June 4th at Loon Lake, Big Bear's rebellion collapsed. Big Bear himself went into hiding, and his band disintegrated. Wandering Spirit, the war chief who had sparked the Cree uprising, surrendered himself in July. He would be tried and hung for his part in Frog Lake. By July 2nd, Big Bear surrendered to Canadian authorities at Fort Carleton, joining Poundmaker in prison. After 3 months of fighting, the Canadian government had succeeded in stamping out all resistance in the West. Though publicized as a triumphant victory, the reality of the Northwest Rebellion was very different. The inexperienced Canadian militia had lost or drawn almost every battle fought against either the Métis or the Iron Confederacy. Their victory came not from success on the battlefield, but by a crushing advantage in supplies, men, and firepower the railway had provided.
I don't believe that the Métis and the First Nations thought they could win by force simply because of the numbers. It was simply frustration. They had tried through negotiation to get the assistance they wanted.
Both Poundmaker and Big Bear were eventually released from prison, thanks in part to the efforts of Crowfoot, Poundmaker's adopted father. While the rebellion's defeat marked the sunset of the Iron Confederacy, it did succeed in gaining more support for Aboriginal communities. The government couldn't afford further rebellions. The victories won by Big Bear and Poundmaker had shown Ottawa that First Nations couldn't simply be brushed aside. The resistance had lost the battle, but won the war, ensuring that their descendants would not simply disappear from the land they had fought so hard to protect. In the 1600s, men from Britain laid claim to eastern North America. But to keep their conquest, they'd have to fight a very different war. Turning to Aboriginal expertise, they created a new type of soldier, trained to adapt and overcome. The Rangers would lead the way to victory. Conquer, surrender, victory, defeat. These deadly battles shaped continents. These are nations at war. Throughout human history, how we wage war has been shaped by the terrain around us. From the Atlantic to the Canadian Shield, forests, wetlands, and waterways carved the landscape into a treacherous wilderness. In this rugged battlefield, warriors launched ambushes and raids, with death being preferable to capture. Better to escape ritual torture or humiliation at the hands of the enemy. Alliances were formed to protect against dangerous rivals or expand a people's power. Nations linked by language, custom, and heritage created the Wabanaki Confederacy to guard the Dawn Land from its enemies. With their allies, the Micmac, they controlled Atlantic Canada. By 1607, they faced a strange new threat. Not in the West, but from across the ocean, which was the edge of their world. Europeans hadn't visited the Americas since the Norse landings in the Middle Ages. Now they had returned, their steel swords and longships replaced by gunpowder and vessels bristling with cannon. These were not opportunistic pirates looking to carve out a new fiefdom for themselves. These were merchants and colonists, sanctioned by the crowned heads of Europe.
The essential condition for the establishment of European colonies was a good trading relationship and a political alliance with local First Nations.
In 1605, French settlers formed a partnership with the local Micmac and built Port Royal, which would grow into the prosperous French colony of Acadia.
This was a relationship, a trading relationship that was built on a partnership, the willingness of both partners to collaborate, each looking out for their own interests, but also trying to establish an enduring relationship that was mutually beneficial.
Established in 1607, the English colony of Jamestown, Virginia, did not enjoy such a friendly relationship with their new neighbors. The Powhatan Confederacy were a prosperous agricultural society, numbering in the thousands and led by a single paramount chief, Wahoo Senakawa. The chief had hoped to resettle the English to a town he controlled, to forge metal in exchange for food.
In the sense, yes, they had never seen perhaps gunpowder rifles, but trade in weapons was not a foreign idea. Trade is a fundamental aspect of First Nations culture. I mean, the groups had centuries and centuries and centuries of experience trading.
The settlers refused to accept his authority. Violence was inevitable. By 1610, war began. The first of 3 such conflicts. Peace finally came in 1646 with the English colony of Virginia now firmly established. Between 1636 and 1638, English colonists fought another bloody war for dominance against the powerful Pequot of Connecticut, ending in a hard-fought British victory. These conflicts taught the English several very important lessons about fighting in the Americas.
What we see is 2 very contrasting forms of warfare.
Though their metal blades and guns outclassed their opponent's traditional weaponry, they had been designed for a very different type of battlefield.
The First Nation groups at first were scared and frightened and intimidated by these weapons, but it did not take long at all for them to understand the very weaknesses that existed in those same guns too.
Heavy, slow to reload, and totally inaccurate past 50 yards. The matchlock musket was designed to be used against masses of enemy troops, protected by walls of pikemen as they reloaded.
You also had a reload time that could get as high as 3 minutes. Now, imagine the first shot misses. Well, in those 3 minutes, a trained First Nations warrior could destroy you.
Though the flintlocks which replaced them were more rugged, lighter, and had better accuracy, European tactics remained largely consistent. In North America, the wilderness made open field battles extremely rare.
A lot of the fighting amongst the First Nations, the tactics were very similar to guerrilla fighting or small wars. A lot of it was set up as surprise attacks where there'd be ambushes.
While firepower could defend their forts against a much larger force of enemies, moving beyond the walls into hostile territory was risky at best. The English would have to adapt because by 1675 they faced a 2-front war against their First Nations neighbors. Provoked to fight by the unjust execution of Wampanoags in Plymouth Colony.
Metacomet was a member of the Wampanoag Nation, and he sort of formed an alliance with a variety of other groups in the region and led this sort of attack against the New Englanders that were encroaching on modern-day Maine, kind of upstate New York.
Among them were the Narragansett. They had allied with the English to defeat their rivals, the Pequot. In the north, the Wabanaki Confederacy launched lightning raids along the borders of Acadia and New England, encouraged by French allies eager to take advantage of the chaos. In the years since the end of the Powhatan and Pequot Wars, the English could no longer rely on firepower to protect them. Dutch, English, and French traders had supplied their native allies with weapons in exchange for pelts and military support. These were then resold by Aboriginal middlemen. The first American arms trade had leveled the playing field. Wabanaki warriors armed with steel axes, knives, and muskets could strike without warning. burning farms, settlements, and killing civilians to stop expansion into their lands, then disappear. If the English hoped to survive, they needed a change of strategy. Leading the call for a tactical evolution was Benjamin Church. A captain in the Plymouth Colony's militia, he realized that emulating Aboriginal tactics was the only hope of victory. Church recruited warriors from among Christian converts and former enemies like the Pequot. These warriors were guides, raiders, and drill instructors, schooling the Englishmen how to travel light, move fast, and hit hard.
It's not that these ideas were foreign to Europeans, but the European military culture thought that this was a cowardly form of fighting, whereas for the First Nations, it just seemed logical to engage in this form of warfare.
Called ranging by the New Englanders, this style of warfare was perfect for the rugged terrain which the enemy used to ambush their militias. Church's Ranger Company soon proved their worth on the battlefield. At the Great Swamp Fight on December 19, 1675, Church's men joined the combined New England militia to destroy the Narragansett stronghold near South Kingston, Rhode Island. Those who survived the fort's fall were forced to flee into a barren wetland where many more perished. Church's Rangers roamed New England, hunting for the leaders keeping resistance alive. By mid-August 1676, Wampanoag Chief Metacomet was shot by an Aboriginal ranger named John Alderman at the Battle of Mount Hope. The war in the South was all but over.
As a result of King Philip's War, the New Englanders, that is the British, and their sort of colonists had secured control over modern-day Maine. They were now threatening expansion into modern-day Nova Scotia and modern-day New Brunswick.
But the Wabanaki Confederacy remained defiant, bolstered by the membership of the Micmac. The stage was now set for a savage contest over eastern North America, where Rangers would set the Dawnland on fire. In 1744, the Empire of Great Britain struggles to hold on to a newly conquered territory they called Nova Scotia. Since the union of Scotland and England in 1707, Great Britain had emerged as an aggressive imperial power, eager to break France's hold on their North American colonies, paving the way for the expansion of their own. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht had ended the War of Spanish Succession and forced France to hand mainland Acadia over to Britain. Many Acadians bitterly resented their new overlords and took up arms, forming a guerrilla resistance backed by the French.
The Canadians, that is the French Canadians born in Canada, very much adopt Indian-style warfare. They become these skirmishers. They learn the tactics.
The local Micmac also refused to bow to a foreign king. Supported by their allies in the Wabanaki Confederacy, they would resist the British occupation. Raiding and frontier warfare was endemic, occasionally broken by periods of shaky peace.
Both the Micmac and the Abenaki were very effective fighters. They were able to launch raids over long distances, over land, sometimes in the middle of the winter.
By 1744, British redcoats trained to fight in open battles with cavalry and artillery had proven unable to crush Wabanaki fighters.
There's numerous examples of this line of European soldiers firing in volley fire repetition while facing First Nation warriors who were countering that fire from behind trees and using the natural cover.
To turn the tide, the British looked to men like John Gorham. Born in Massachusetts, Gorham's grandfather had fought alongside Benjamin Church in the wars for New England. He knew what Aboriginal warriors were capable of and how to fight them. The same Pequots and Wampanoags who had resisted so fiercely were recruited to fight side by side with British Americans and men from the rugged corners of Scotland and Ireland, to whom they taught guerrilla tactics.
New England produced a number of different ranger companies beginning from the 1670s onwards, largely a somewhat belated response to the realities of North American warfare.
Using whaling boats to move swiftly along the Nova Scotia coastline, Gorham's Rangers were an extraordinary military innovation. Where British regulars relied on discipline and massed firepower to win the day, Rangers favored stealth, cunning, and savagery. Nova Scotia's dense woodlands cloaked the movements of Micmac guerrillas and shielded their communities from reprisal. Self-sufficient hunters and supported by the neighboring French territories, they could fight as long as their will held out. So Gorham would have to break it. If the First Nations would not bow to British authority, they would be wiped out. Highly mobile, largely independent, and capable of missions regular troops weren't, the Rangers were a remarkable break from British military tradition. The first modern special forces.
So they weren't regular soldiers, but many of them were tough frontiersmen. They were able to shoot, they understood the terrain, they had either fought with or fought against First Nation groups. They understood the style of warfare that typified skirmishers, sharpshooters, and First Nation warriors.
By 1755, the Rangers had become Britain's most effective means of suppressing Aboriginal and Acadian resistance in the Dawnland. A role which only grew more important as the 7 Years' War began, making a local war of resistance a vital theater in a global showdown between the greatest empires of the day. "1755. The world is at war, and the Dawnland is burning." Since the construction of Halifax in 1749, violence had spread across Nova Scotia.
So it's kind of a tit-for-tat game, you know. The French build Louisbourg, the British build Halifax, and then the Acadians and Wabanaki strike the British to prevent them from constructing or expanding their control in the Maritimes any further.
Now, as the imperial rivalry between Great Britain and France exploded into the 7 Years' War, this local conflict became part of a much larger one. With many Acadians choosing to resist their forced removal from their lands and the Micmac rallying to their defense, Britain quickly assembled new ranger companies, freeing up regular troops for the assault on strongholds like Quebec, Montreal, and Louisbourg, which were vital to New France's defense. Among these new companies was one led by a fiery frontiersman named Robert Rogers.
And so the first appear in the 1670s, but most of the ranger companies that are best known to us are active during the 7 Years' War. Of course, the most famous of these is Rogers Rangers.
Where Church and Gorham had pioneered ranging, Rogers perfected it. Combining inspiring leadership with single-minded ferocity, Rogers wrote a guidebook for his men, The 28 Rules of Ranging. In it, he helped lay the foundations for the small unit tactics used by modern infantry around the world.
They act as scouts for British forces during the 7 Years' War, but they also conduct a few operations on their own.
Beginning operations along the frontier between New York and Quebec. Ambushing patrols, burning villages, and even massacring civilians.
Probably the best well known is Rogers' company's raid on the Abenaki community of St. Francis in 1759, in which this community was entirely destroyed.
Rogers' unit proved so effective that it was expanded, and 4 companies were redeployed to the battlefront in Nova Scotia. In 1758, Rogers' Rangers would play a key part in the siege of Louisbourg, where a force under General James Wolfe was preparing to open the St. Lawrence River to a British invasion.
One of the most expensive fortresses in all of North America. Also one of the most poorly built fortresses in all of North America. The idea, of course, was that the French, through the construction of Louisbourg, would stop the British from being able to send a naval contingent into the Gulf of St. Lawrence.
Skilled at amphibious assaults, Rogers' men swept into a sheltered cove guarded by 100 French and Micmac. Driving off the defenders, the Rangers paved the way for Wolfe's main force to land. With Wolfe's army ashore, the French fort and garrison stood little chance. Louisbourg's fall exposed the heartland of New France to the British military. By the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, Rogers had risen in rank to become a major. His company of Rangers had become so important that it had grown to a corps of 1,400 men, including several companies of entirely Aboriginal Rangers. Though hard drinking and poor finances would eventually drive Robert Rogers to a pauper's grave in London, the style of highly mobile warfare he used has endured. During the American Revolution, Ranger units fought on both sides, including the King's Rangers and the Queen's Rangers, both raised and led by Rogers himself. After the war ended in a British defeat, veterans of the Queen's Rangers reformed into a new regiment which remains a part of the Canadian Army today. To this day, members of the U.S. Army Rangers are still issued Rogers Standing Orders, a way of fighting born from generations of First Nations warfare, taught to their enemies by centuries of bloodshed, now practiced by the deadliest warriors on the 21st century battlefield.